Beneath the wagon's splintered floorboards, a secret lay waiting. A secret that would not only unmake the man who cast her out, but would also build her a life from the wreckage. She was 19 years old. For all intents and purposes, she was homeless. No family left to speak of. No money in her pockets. Her only plan was to keep putting one foot in front of the other. All she owned was a blacksmith's hammer, its hickory handle worn smooth by a dead man's grip, and the $20 she got from selling his tools. With that $20, she bought the salvage rights to an abandoned freight wagon. It lay wrecked at the bottom of Red Creek Canyon. But what no one in Providence knew, what they couldn't see as they mocked her from the canyon rim, was the true value of that wreck. Dina Boone wasn't born to the red dust of Utah territory. She was born to the damp, dark soil of Missouri. She remembered it only in flashes of green and the smell of thunderstorms. Her parents had died of cholera on the trail west when she was 5. Their names and faces faded over time until only their absence remained. A distant cousin took her in the fledgling settlement of Providence. His charity was as thin and brittle as winter ice. For 10 years, she was a shadow in his house, an extra mouth to feed, a pair of hands for the dirtiest chores. She learned silence and observation. She learned how to make herself small. She learned how to read men's intentions in the set of their jaws. Her only comfort was Jedediah Croft, the town blacksmith. He was a widower. His hands were maps of soot and calluses, but his eyes were clear and kind. He saw the girl who lingered by his forge, watching the magic of iron and fire. He recognized the steady focus in her gaze. He began to teach her simple things first, banking the coals, working the bellows. Then came the more complex arts, drawing out steel, folding it, quenching it. He taught her how to feel the temper in the ring of a hammer strike. He taught her that every piece of metal has a memory, and every piece of wood a grain. He gave her a small hammer he'd forged himself. Its head was perfectly balanced. Its handle was shaped for her hand. It was the first thing anyone had ever made just for her. She kept it with her always, a solid, tangible piece of affection in a life that had offered little of it. Jedediah's death that winter, from a lung fever, left Dina truly alone. He had been her shield, her teacher, her only family. Now, that buffer between her and the harsh judgment of Providence was gone. Bishop Thorne, a man whose piety was a cloak for his greed, saw his chance. He saw a young woman without ties, living on a valuable piece of land with a smithy. He saw opportunity. Dina felt it with a deep certainty. She had spent her life learning to read the quiet cruelties of powerful men. Her time in the forge's shelter was ending. Jedediah had given her not just skill, but the small hammer she clutched now. Its weight was a constant reminder of the one person who had seen her as more than a burden. The end came not with a shout, but with the rustle of paper. Bishop Thorne didn't come himself. He sent his clerk, a pale young man with ink-stained fingers who wouldn't meet Dina's eyes. He stood in the smithy doorway. The smell of coal dust and quenching steam swirled around him. He held out a ledger sheet. It was a list, he explained in a hushed, flat voice. Debts Jedediah Croft owed to the town tithing office and to Thorne's own store. The numbers were made up. Dina knew Jedediah had either forged his own tools or paid cash for his supplies. The total was too large. A girl with nothing could never pay it. At the bottom, in the bishop's elegant handwriting, was an offer. If Dina signed over the smithy and its land, the debt would disappear. She had 24 hours to leave. There was no room to argue. The paper was an order, cold and final, like a gravestone. Dina didn't beg. She didn't cry. She had learned long ago that such displays only pleased men like Thorne. She simply nodded. She took the paper. Then she closed the heavy oak door. The rest of that day was a quiet ritual of letting go. She cleaned the forge. Years of dust and iron filings went into a neat pile. She oiled Jedediah's tools, the big rounding hammer, the flatters, the fullers, the tongs he had shaped for every task. She arranged them on the rack where they belonged. A man from the mercantile came to inventory them. His eyes lingered on the Peterite anvil, the heart of the shop. He offered her $20 for everything. It was a pittance, but it was more than nothing. She took the money without a word. She packed a small canvas sack, a change of clothes, a skillet, a little flour, and a tin of coffee, a block of matches. Jedediah's hammer, wrapped in an oilcloth, went deep inside. As the sun set, Long, sharp shadows stretched across the dirt street. She walked out of the only home she had ever truly known. She left the door unlocked. She did not look back. The cruelty was not in the taking. It was in the sterile, administrative way it was done. A life erased by a few strokes of a pen. She walked south, away from the orderly grid of Providence. The town faded behind her. She moved into the wild, broken country that fell away into deep canyons. With every kilometer, the air grew drier. The familiar scent of wood smoke and livestock slowly gave way to the clean, sharp smell of sagebrush and sun-baked sandstone. The road itself dissolved into a dusty track, winding its way down a long, sloping escarpment. Each step took her further from the world of men. She kept a steady, unhurried pace. Her eyes weren't on the distant horizon. They were fixed on the ground before her. She was reading the land, just as Jedediah had taught her to read iron. She saw how the junipers clung to the north-facing slopes. She noticed the patterns of erosion, marks left by ancient floods. Even the faint tracks of a coyote passed that morning caught her eye. This was not a landscape of gentle comforts. It was a place of stark, honest beauty. It demanded respect. It demanded attention. By late afternoon, she reached the floor of Red Creek Canyon. The walls rose up on either side, sheer cliffs of crimson and ochre rock. They were layered like pages in a great stone book. The creek itself was a thin, life-giving ribbon of green. Cottonwood leaves shimmered in the slightest breeze along its banks. The silence here was immense. Only the buzz of insects and the distant cry of a hawk circling high overhead broke it. A kilometer downstream, she found what she was looking for, a small dugout, little more than a cave carved into the hard-packed earth of a cut bank. It was likely an old line shack left by a stockman long gone. The roof was a lattice of juniper logs covered with soil and sod. A crude stone chimney stood at one end. It was abandoned. It was crumbling, but it was shelter. She swept it out with a branch. Her movements were methodical and calm. She gathered dry wood and started a small, efficient fire in the stone hearth. Then she made a simple meal of fried dough and black coffee. As dusk filled the canyon, turning the red rock to a deep, bruised purple, Dina sat on a flat stone by the creek. The small hammer rested in her lap. She felt no despair. Instead, there was a quiet, bracing clarity. She had been ejected from one life. Now she had to begin another. The day's fatigue settled into her bones. A deep, satisfying ache. She had moved. She had survived. And as the first stars appeared in the sliver of sky above the canyon rim, she knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow, she would work. The next morning, Dina walked the canyon floor looking for anything useful. About 400 meters from her dugout, she found it. A freight wagon, wedged sideways in a deep, sandy washout. Its back axle was snapped clean, the tongue splintered. It had been there for a long time, through at least one winter and a summer. The canvas cover was gone, rotted away to a few tattered strips that fluttered in the breeze. Paint on the sideboards was peeled and bleached by the sun, but she could still make out faint letters. A Salt Lake City freight company. To anyone else, it was just a wreck. Forgotten junk. To the Providence riders who sometimes came along the canyon rim, it marked a failure, a reminder of some long-ago accident. Dina saw something different. She ran her hand over the iron tires. They were sound, pitted with rust, but not deeply corroded. She looked at the hubs and the remaining spokes, noting the tight grain of good hickory. The sideboards were oak, weathered, but not rotten. The wagon bed itself, though full of sand and debris, was made of thick, solid planks. She saw hinges and brackets, bolts and braces. A treasure trove of forged iron, ready to be heated and reshaped. She saw lumber that could reinforce her dugout. It could build a door, a table, a cot. She saw not a wreck, but a kit of raw materials. The challenge was where it sat. The wagon was deeply mired in the wash, weighing well over 450 kilograms. The bank leading up to the flat ground by her camp was steep and loose. It was a task for a team of mules and 3 strong men. Dina had only herself. She spent the rest of the day planning. Her mind worked through the familiar calculus of leverage and mechanics. Jedediah had taught her this. She went back to her dugout and got a length of rope from her pack. Then, using her belt axe, she fashioned what she needed from the landscape itself. She found a sturdy deadfall cottonwood and spent hours shaping it into a thick, functional lever. She scouted the bank for solid anchor points, a deep-rooted juniper, a protrusion of solid rock. The problem was not one of brute strength, but of patience and physics. That evening, Dina walked back into Providence. Her face was set. She went straight to the mercantile. With $10 of her $20, she bought 2 pulleys and 15 meters of thick hemp rope. The clerk gave her a curious look, but Dina offered no explanation. She spent her last $10 on a sack of flour, some beans, and a side of salt pork. She was investing everything she had in this wreckage. She was all in. Her work began at dawn. Over the next 2 days, the canyon became a theater of quiet, relentless labor, with Dina as the sole actor and the town of Providence as her unwitting audience. Riders on the rim trail would stop, watching for a while. Sometimes they shouted down mockingly, "That wagon's been there a year, girl," one man yelled, his laughter echoing off the rock walls. "What do you think you're going to do with it?" She never looked up. She never acknowledged them. Her focus was absolute. She rigged a block and tackle, anchoring one pulley to the stoutest root of the juniper tree high on the bank. The other pulley she tied to the wagon's front axle. She used her cottonwood pole as a capstan, driving it deep into the ground and winding the rope around it. This gave her precious mechanical advantage. It was a slow, grueling process. She would dig the sand and rock away from the wheels. Then she would winch the rope, straining with every muscle in her back and arms. The wagon would groan, shift, and move a few centimeters. The sound of splintering wood and scraping metal was sharp in the canyon silence. Then she would reset her anchors, re-rig the capstan, and begin again. Inch by inch, foot by foot, she coaxed the massive wreck up the sandy slope. Her hands were raw, her muscles screaming with effort, but her movements were economical and precise. She worked through the heat of the day, taking breaks only to drink from the creek and chew on a piece of hard tack. On the evening of the second day, with a final shuddering lurch, the wagon cleared the lip of the bank. It settled onto the flat ground near her camp. She stood for a long moment, hands on her hips, breathing heavily, covered in dust and sweat, and looked at her prize. The mocking voices from the rim had fallen silent. Subscribe if you want to see what happens when quiet determination meets a challenge this big. There's a lot more to this story, and the real surprise is still hidden. The next morning, Dina began the careful work of taking the wagon apart. She started with the wagon bed. Her plan was to use its thick oak planks to build a proper door and floor for her dugout. She used a small pry bar she'd found in Jedediah's old things. It helped her work the first board loose. But as she pried, something felt wrong. The floorboards were unusually thick, almost 7.5 centimeters. They didn't sit right on the wagon's crossmembers. There was a clear gap underneath. Her curiosity grew. She tapped along the wood with her hammer, listening. Near the front, the sound changed. It was hollow. She looked closer at how the pieces fit together. The joinery was too fine, too precise for a simple cargo floor. This was the work of a cabinet maker, not a wagon builder. Running her fingers along a seam between 2 planks, she felt a small, almost invisible indentation. She pressed it. A section of the floor, about 1.2 meters square, lifted with a soft click. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She lifted the heavy panel away. Beneath it lay a hidden compartment, a false bottom lined with dark felt. Nestled inside was a sight that made her forget her aching muscles. It erased the mocking laughter and the gnawing loneliness of the past few days. The compartment's contents were laid out with a traveler's careful precision. There were 5 long bundles, each wrapped in oilcloth and tied with leather thongs. A heavy, iron-banded express box sat beside them. It was small, but dense. The stenciled mark of Wells Fargo and Company was clear on its side, and next to that, protected in a worn leather satchel, was a thin ledger book. Dina's hands trembled slightly. She reached for the nearest oilcloth bundle. She untied the thong. Then she unrolled the stiff, waxy fabric. Inside, resting on a bed of raw wool, was a rifle. It was unlike any she had ever seen. The stock was a deep, swirling walnut, polished to a satin sheen. The barrel was octagonal. Its blued steel finish was a deep, liquid black. The lock plate and hammer were engraved with delicate scrollwork. This was master craftsmanship, not a standard-issue weapon. She knew enough from Jedediah to recognize that. She unwrapped the other 4 bundles, each held a rifle of similar quality. Each one was a unique piece of functional art. These were custom-built firearms. They were meant for wealthy clients. They were worth a fortune. Then she turned to the express box. It was locked. But the lock was simple. She used the tip of a file and a small piece of iron wire. Carefully, she picked it. The tumblers fell into place with a series of satisfying clicks. She lifted the heavy lid. The box was filled to the brim with gold coins. Double eagles minted in San Francisco. Their surfaces gleamed in the morning sun. It was $5,000 in gold. More money than she had ever seen. More money than most people in Providence would see in a lifetime. Finally, she opened the leather satchel. Inside were 2 items, a shipping manifest and a driver's log. The ink was written in a neat, steady hand. Dina sat on the ground, leaning against a wagon wheel. She started reading the manifest. It listed the cargo, 5 custom sporting rifles. The U.S. Department of the Interior had commissioned them. Then, 1 Wells Fargo Express box. Inside, $5,000 in gold coin. This was the payment for the rifles. The manifest said the destination was the U.S. Army garrison at Fort Cameron. A gunsmith in Salt Lake City, Elias Thorne, was the sender. The man who was supposed to receive the shipment, the one who would arrange its final transport, was Thorne's own brother, Bishop Alastair Thorne of Providence. Next, she looked at the driver's log. Silas Kane was the driver's name. The last entry was dated over a year ago. It read, "Entering Red Creek Canyon, Bishop Thorne to meet me at the south end." A cold dread settled deep in Dina's stomach. She remembered the whispers from a year back. Talk of a government shipment gone missing. A driver had vanished. Everyone presumed bandits had robbed and killed him in the canyons. Bishop Thorne himself had even led the search party. Of course, they found nothing. He had publicly mourned the loss, blaming the lawlessness of the territory. But the truth was here, in her hands. Thorne hadn't been the victim of a robbery. He had been the architect of one. Bishop Thorne knew about the rifles and the gold. He staged the whole thing. He murdered Silas Kane. Then he shoved the wagon into the washout. He never imagined anyone would have the strength or the foolishness to drag it out. The discovery shifted everything. The wagon was no longer just salvage. It was a crime scene. The rifles were not just valuable, they were evidence. The gold was not just wealth, it was leverage. Dina spent the rest of the day in quiet, deliberate action. She rewrapped the rifles. Then she placed them back in the compartment. She closed the express box. She slid it into the deepest corner of her dugout. A pile of firewood covered it. The manifest and logbook she wrapped in oilcloth. She tucked them inside her shirt. The stiff paper was a constant secret reminder against her skin. Her first priority was clear. She needed to transform her camp from a temporary shelter into a defensible home. The world had suddenly become a more dangerous place. She worked with the oak planks from the wagon bed. Dina used Jedediah's saw and a brace and bit to cut and shape a heavy, solid door for her dugout. She built a frame for it from the wagon sideboards. Then she took an iron tire, heated the metal in her small hearth fire, and hammered it into hinges on a flat rock that served as her anvil. Jedediah's hammer felt like an extension of her own arm. Its familiar weight and balance guided her hands. The rhythmic clang of steel on steel was a comforting, defiant sound in the canyon silence. The remaining lumber became a floor. Dina raised it slightly off the dirt to keep out the damp. She built a simple cot, a small table, and shelves. By the end of the week, the crumbling dugout had become a snug, fortified cabin. Its entrance was barred by a door that could withstand a battering ram. As she worked, Dina felt a shift in the canyon air. The story of her single-handed salvage of the wagon had spread through Providence. The mockery she faced before had turned into a grudging, curious respect. One afternoon, a freighter named Abram stopped his team on the rim trail. His face was a roadmap of desert, sun, and wind. He didn't say a word. He just unhitched a barrel of fresh water from his wagon, lowered it down the bank with a rope, and left it for her. A few days later, Martha Jessup made her way down the trail. Martha was a widow who lived on the edge of town and kept to herself. She carried a steaming pot of rabbit stew. She said very little. She just looked at the work Dina had done, the solid door, the neat stack of firewood. She nodded her approval. A body needs a decent meal when they're working this hard, was all she said. Dina thanked her. The next day, she walked into town. She used a piece of the wagon's iron to forge a new latch for Martha's broken garden gate. The work was clean and strong. These were the first threads of community. They weren't woven with words of friendship. They were quiet acts of practical exchange and mutual respect. Dina's position began to solidify, not through any declaration, but through the steady application of her craft. People from the outskirts of Providence, those who felt the bishop's influence less keenly, began to seek her out. A farmer needed a broken plowshare fixed. A rancher needed new brands forged. A mother had a kettle that lost its handle. They would leave the broken item by her camp. They would leave a small payment of food, a sack of potatoes, a clutch of eggs, a slab of bacon. Dina would do the work. Her repairs were strong and honest. She would leave the mended item in the same spot for them to collect. Her name was spoken with new weight. She was no longer the orphan girl, the outcast. She was Dina Boone, the smith at Red Creek. Her identity forged as surely as the iron she worked. She was becoming a part of the place. The secret she carried was a heavy weight. Bishop Thorne was a powerful man. If he ever found out what she had found, her life would be in danger. Dina needed an ally, someone outside the bishop's reach. Her chance came with Elias Vance, the U.S. Marshal for the territory. He rode into Providence once a month. He was a tall man, worn down by the job, with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too much. His territory stretched thousands of miles across unforgiving land. Dina waited until he was leaving town. She intercepted him on the trail that ran past the canyon rim. She stood right in the middle of the track. This forced his horse to stop. He looked down at the young woman, her face smudged with soot, her hands rough with calluses. He looked annoyed. "What is it, miss?" he asked. "Marshal," she said, her voice steady. "I have something you need to see." He was skeptical, but something in her direct, unflinching gaze made him dismount. She led him down the steep path to her camp. He took it all in: the dismantled wagon, the strengthened dugout, the small, efficient forge. He had a practiced, assessing eye. Inside her small home, she unwrapped one of the rifles. She laid it on the table. The marshal's eyes widened. He picked it up, his hands moving over it with an expert's touch. "This is Elias Thorne's work," he said, his voice low. "The gunsmith from Salt Lake. There's not another man in the territory who can do this. There are 4 more like it," Dina said. Then she laid the manifest and Silas Kane's logbook on the table next to the rifle. The marshal read the document slowly, his brow furrowed in concentration. He remembered the case of the missing shipment. It had been a loose end, a puzzle that bothered him. Now the pieces were clicking into place. He looked from the papers to Dina. "Where did you get this?" "From the false bottom of that wagon," she said, gesturing outside. "The one Bishop Thorne said was robbed by bandits." The marshal was silent for a long time. The truth of what she said settled heavily in the small room. He looked at the girl before him. She was young and alone, but she had a formidable will. She had not only uncovered a crime, but had built a life from its leavings. "You've put yourself in a great deal of danger, Miss Boone, I know," she said simply. "That's why I'm talking to you." The marshal sat in Dina's small cabin, the rifle resting across his knees, the manifest still clutched in his hand. He had seen men like Bishop Thorne before, men who used faith like a shield and power like a weapon. They were always the hardest to take down. Their roots sank deep into a community. But the evidence Dina had uncovered was solid, an official, signed manifest, the dead driver's final entry in his logbook, and the actual cargo Thorne claimed had been stolen. It all made a clean, straight line to a conviction. "I'll need your testimony," he said, his voice flat and official. "And I'll need these items as evidence." Dina simply nodded. "They're safer with you than with me." Marshal Vance made his arrangements quietly. He deputized Abram, the freighter, and 2 other men. These men were not from Providence. They owed no loyalty to the bishop. They rode into town at dawn, not at midday when the streets were full. They went straight to Bishop Thorne's large stone house, the one that stood beside the church. Dina stayed at her camp in the canyon. The marshal had told her to. But Abram's son rode out to tell her what was happening. She stood by her forge, the air cool and still. She watched the smoke rise from the town's chimneys. She imagined the scene playing out. The confrontation she later heard was quiet. The bishop, roused from his sleep, was full of righteous indignation. He was angry until the marshal laid the manifest on his polished dining table. Thorne's face went pale. He saw the name of the driver, Silas Kane, and his own brother's signature, and he knew he was undone. He offered no resistance. The marshal placed him under arrest for grand larceny, mail fraud, and suspicion of murder. The news spread through Providence like a grass fire. The bishop's arrest created a power vacuum. The townspeople, finally free from his oppressive influence, began to speak openly. They talked about his land grabs, his unfair business practices, and his heavy-handed rule. With Thorne gone, the town seemed to take a collective breath. It was quieter, perhaps, but more honest. Weeks later, a letter arrived for Dina from the territorial court. As the person who found the abandoned wagon and its contents, she now legally owned everything. The rifles, once evidence, were returned to her. They were hers to keep. Marshal Vance himself delivered the Wells Fargo box. Inside was $5,000 in gold. She instantly became one of the wealthiest people in the region. She used the money to buy the smithy first. A flustered town clerk signed over the deed. Dina walked back into the place. The smell of cold iron and dust felt like an old friend. She spent months restoring it. She didn't change it, but brought it back to life. She used the resources she had earned to build her new life. She was no longer an outcast. She became an anchor. People came to her, not just for repairs, but for advice. Her judgment, like her ironwork, was sound and true. She had a place. She had a name. She had a home. Dina Boone stood in the wide doorway of the smithy. Early morning light slanted across the hard-packed dirt floor. The air was cool. It carried the familiar smell of banked coals in the forge. That scent now meant purpose, not loss. Her hands were clean, but forever marked by soot and calluses. They rested on the worn oak of the doorframe. Inside, the shop felt alive. Tools hung on racks. They weren't museum pieces, but instruments waiting for the day's work. The great Peter Wright anvil stood solid in the center of the room. Its surface was scarred and beautiful from a lifetime of service. On the workbench, against the far wall, two objects sat side by side. One was the small, perfectly balanced hammer Jedediah Croft had made for her. Its hickory handle glowed with the patina of use and affection. It was a tool of creation. It symbolized the quiet love and practical knowledge a good man had given her. Beside it lay one of Elias Thorne's custom rifles. This was a tool of destruction, but it was also a thing of exquisite craftsmanship. It was the physical proof of a crime that led to her salvation. It represented another craftsman, another brother, betrayed by the man who had cast her out. She thought of Silas Kane, the driver. His last written words had been his own unwitting death sentence. In a way, he had been her hidden benefactor. He left her a legacy he never intended. A map to justice, written in a simple logbook. She had become the unlikely executive of his last delivery. Providence had settled into a new rhythm without Bishop Thorne. It was quieter, perhaps, but it was more honest. People looked each other in the eye. Abram the freighter now stopped at the smithy on every trip. They shared coffee and news from the wider world. Martha Jessup brought her fresh bread every Saturday. Dina Boone was 19 years old. She had been homeless. She had $20 to her name. She spent half of it on the salvage rights to a wrecked wagon everyone else saw as junk. It was the best $10 she had ever spent. She was 19, homeless, and with almost nothing to her name. But now, Dina Boone was 19, established, and a respected anchor in her community. Her story shows us something vital. True value is often hidden in plain sight. It's easily missed by most, but it reveals itself to those with the vision and the will to salvage it. If finding that kind of unseen opportunity speaks to you, subscribe. And tell us in the comments, what have you found value in that everyone else overlooked?